Okay, so welcome everyone. I hope everyone has a cup of tea with them and strap yourself in for a fun hour talking about play and community participation in planning and housing. So welcome to the second workshop session of our People Powered Places paper, our practice's second self-initiated annual research project. This project is seeking to explore best practice in community participation in planning and housing and enable capacity building in the office so that we are better placed to support our clients to meet the needs and aspirations of communities and all building users. My name is Ozan and I recently just completed my part 3 at the practice, and along with colleagues in Dublin and London, I joined the People Powered Places focus group, which is facilitated jointly by Dhruv Suku and Ava Lynam. In the coming months, this group will collaborate to prepare a simple set of principles to guide and evaluate our practice approach to community participation in housing and planning, which we hope to launch in spring 2022. The purpose of today's session is to consider how best to consider the needs and aspirations of children and young people during community participation. And we're delighted to welcome Dinah Bornat, who's a director at ZCD Architects, to talk about her research into neighbourhood design and play and the techniques that she has developed to enable young people to participate meaningfully in design and planning and development processes. Dinah is a leading proponent of child-friendly cities, was a recipient of the RIBA research grant in 2017, exploring neighbourhood design focusing on the London Borough of Hackney, and is aiming to develop participatory approaches to articulate the needs for the younger generation. Dinah is also a mayor's design advocate for the Mayor of London and the chair of the Child Friendly Cities Sounding Board, which produced the Making London Child Friendly report, which promotes place design and streets for children and young people. More recently, Dinah has collaborated with Grosvenor, I hope I've said that right, the TCPA and Sport England to create a toolkit to encourage young people to participate in the making and management of their neighbourhoods. Following Dinah's talk, Tom Mitchell, a studio director in London, and I'll present a short talk each. Mine concentrates on why I've developed an interest and a passion for this topic in the first place, which kind of developed through my research in UCD when I was in college. And then Tom will discuss his personal and professional experience of the legacy and lessons of the provision of informal and planned play spaces and sports facilities in Crawley, Newtown. And then hopefully after about half an hour or so, we'll conclude the workshop with a practice conversation, which will be chaired by Tom, and then summary thoughts by Ava. So let's get going. And I think Dinah's up first, so over to you, Dinah.
Thanks for a nice introduction. Okay, come on Teams. I'm trying to share my screen now. I feel like I've got a very old warhorse of a computer that's still alive. One day it's going to die on me in the middle of the presentation. I'm just going through. Okay.
Okay, I think you're sharing.
I'm showing my whole screen now, aren't I? That's not what I want to do. Okay. Let me try and do apologise. It's very. No, again. Sorry.
It's okay. We'll edit this bit out, so just.
Yeah. I press window. And then I find the one. Here we go.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know why it is we use Teams. It drives me around. There we go. Right.
Perfect.
Right. And I'm going to say, oops. Right. Let's just pretend we started right there. Okay, so this was our practice a year ago, actually, and we've grown a bit since then. As was introduced, and possibly you might have read Edges and Hedges, which was something that I think your practice helped publish for Harrow when we were set up as the design review panel a few years ago. So it's quite a good introduction to sort of play and why we should be thinking about it for children and for developments. So I'm going to talk about quite a lot of stuff that I present often to planners or developers, and to sort of give an overview, but I'm obviously thinking about talking to architects. I think participation isn't something that I deliberately went into, and I know that it's something that young practices often do as a way of sort of getting a foothold. That's quite interesting, I think, but also I think slightly devalues it in some ways, because I think it's really important as architects and as directors and as the sort of lead on projects, we are properly engaging with the people that we're working with. And I'm going to show you how we do that and why it's massively rewarding. So for us, being architects and engagement specialists, it goes hand in hand. We definitely aren't just one or the other. So that's the format of the talk, and I think I'm going to talk for 20 minutes. I'll try and make it a little bit shorter because I was so slow in starting. I often show this slide, really simply, why child-friendly cities? There's lots of reasons, but we can really come at it from a rights point of view. So the UN Conventions on the Rights of the Child have several rights that children should be able to enjoy, and the UK has signed up to those, and so the right to play and the right to participate are in there. And the right to play is something that is a right for children. It's not a right for adults. Play is something that children do just because they do it, and it's part of their development as well, but it's something that's just about the way that they live, and it's important for them. So having it as a right sets it really, I think, above this idea that we have the rights that we have to the freedoms that we have to the city, and for them to have the right to play in the city gives it a very different kind of flavour. We also tend to say that it works for all people, and I think that's true to a great extent, but there are obviously challenges and differences in the way people use space. But I think what's really interesting about taking a large group and a group that we've all been, so that's quite universal in that respect, and really thinking about it from their point of view, then sets us on a journey of dialogue and discussion where we can start to think about how cities work for everybody. So I often get asked, what about other age groups? And I think, yes, what about other age groups? And the more I work, the more I like to concentrate on children and young people. And I'm really grateful that other people are concentrating on other age groups. We are working with some older people and some people with disabilities on a project. And what's really interesting is we're using some of the techniques that we use with children, and we're using them in exactly the same way with other people. I'll explain in a minute. So policy and guidance. You may be aware that at the London level, there's a lot of policy now that's really talking about child-friendly cities. So it's in the London plan. It's woven through the housing design standards. It's in the London Child-Friendly Report, which is kind of supporting a new SPG coming forward. There's Tim Gill's book on the urban playground, which really talks about it from a kind of leadership point of view. And then boroughs are introducing child-friendly policy in different ways. So Hackney's got the first supplementary planning document. Tower Hamlets has got a high density living document, which has a huge amount about child-friendly cities. And at least 2 boroughs have already got, are already working towards becoming child-friendly, and there are others that are in the pipeline. I should say that UNICEF have a limit to the number of boroughs they can work with. So it would be great if all the boroughs were working towards becoming child-friendly, but the phrase has a sort of a slightly strange ownership, in that I think UNICEF believe they coined it. So that's why you won't see lots of boroughs saying they are child-friendly. But never mind. I mean, being child-friendly should be everywhere. So let's just all own it, I think. In the London plan, it's worth unpacking what these 2 boxes are saying. And in section 4 on play and informal recreation, these were previously in the SPG on play and informal recreation, and now that they've come up into the London plan, they've got greater weight. So some of these elements, if we just run through, and I don't usually do this, but I think it's useful for you guys, section 2, which is in the box, so it's high level. This talks about what it means, and it's quite strategic. So we all know about the 10 square metres rule. That's something that we are, I think, sadly not meeting on all developments that I work on. We're seeing the 10 square metres being achieved perhaps for the under 12s, but the over 12s are expected to go off site, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But these elements, if you read them carefully, are actually quite a good way of thinking about the environment. So the stimulating environment can be accessed safely from the street. So if we really think about how children get around, do you think they can get to all the places that we're designing for them? If they can access it independently, what would the test be? Could you walk us through your development? Could you show us where they might go? It's an integral part of the surrounding neighbourhood. It's got trees and greenery. It's overlooked and it's not segregated by tenure. Now, you probably remember the story a couple of years ago in The Guardian, which was something that I was very keen to get into the public, which was basically about how play was and is, and to a certain extent, being sort of restricted on a development in London that was fairly recent. That exposed the kind of segregation by tenure, the tick box approach that was just basically separating children that were going to the same primary school when they came home and couldn't play with each other. So like, it was so easy for everybody to realise that that was wrong, and yet it was just being done without any thought. So the other thing on the other books is this idea of how children get around, because it's all very well making spaces for them, but if they can't get to them easily, it's pointless. So we've got to really think about the urban design. So this one's suggesting that this point says there's a lack of formal, there's not often because of a lack of formal play provision, but it's a restrictive street design and layouts, poor links between spaces for play and recreation, and busy roads and traffic. So, you know, obviously there's a massive risk with cars, and we've really got to think about how we remove those from children's everyday experience. They're small. They don't deal with cars in the same way as us. Things like shared surfaces, I think, offer real problems for them. So we've got to think about it from the point of view of the child. So we've been doing research on this for about 7 years. We got really interested in it for a number of different reasons, partly because we wanted to expand into housing, but also because we were seeing play happening in some places and not in others, and a whole load of anecdotal, incorrect, I think, thoughts about the fact that, you know, children weren't playing out at all. I can tell you that they are, and they do, but it's massively varied. In some places that we visit, children play out more than perhaps you or I did when we were children, but generally speaking, the average is low. And we started to think that had a lot to do, or did it have a lot to do, with the design and the layout of places. So basically, as architects, was this something we needed to know about how we laid out development? So there's a series of reports, and we published them. And we put them all on our website, so you can see and download them all for free. Starting with the one on the left, Housing Design for Community Life, where we got some funding from Homes England, off the back of some research I'd done with some students. Homes England were keen for us to look at developments outside London, because that's what they fund. So though we did a couple in London, these are mostly low density developments, and we kind of picked a range, some that we thought might be working well, and some kind of at least one real standard house builder, you know, roads and car parking and back gardens sort of thing, and then a few sort of award-winning ones because we wanted to test them. And what was really interesting is that we didn't find that, for example, Lime Tree Square, where we've got pictures of children playing out, were performing as well as they kind of were suggesting when they first opened. And the reasons were, we seem to think, to do with the layout. And the first thing what we wanted to do was, I should explain, the way we worked out the sort of levels of children playing out and how people were using spaces was, we basically had two researchers standing in two separate spots, counting people for 24 hours altogether in each development. So we were doing 6 hours over 4 days, and 6 hours over 2 days in two different places. And so we got a really good feel for how much time people were using the space for and how often. And we did that in the summer because we wanted to get sort of high figures so that we could sort of compare these schemes with each other. So we started to think that it might have something to do with the space itself, how easy it was to access from homes, how well these spaces were connected to each other. This was before the London plan came out. The accessibility of the space itself, and I think those two top maps are fairly similar. And then the kind of street arrangement, because especially outside London, the kind of street arrangement is critical, and there are a lot of places where that really does break down, so you get backs to fronts and so on. And we started to put these figures together and sort of assess these 4 elements and put it against the numbers of children playing and people socialising outside. We saw a correlation between how many people were outside with how many children were outside playing independently. There are a couple of outliers. One of those was in London, and the high density suggested that we needed a different way of mapping it. And another one was in York, where the mapping rate was quite low, but the number of people outside was high. That was because there was an event going on, so there was a kind of unusual amount of people there. But generally speaking, we wanted to get a kind of mapping correlation between our observed numbers of people and a kind of way that we could simplify what the elements were that were supporting it. We then got some money, and I think we just explained just before how we were looking at an estate in Hackney. We launched our first report alongside the Policy Studies Institute, now no longer with us, but was at University of Westminster, who've been working on children's independent mobility for generations, since the 70s, I think. And we worked together looking at an estate in Hackney, where the Mayor of Hackney said to us, please, we want to do some infill development on this estate. We're not going to start from scratch. It's not a estate renewal. And so we were able to have sort of access to all the spaces, which actually, to be fair, you can do anyway. But with their permission, and to look at 5 different spaces across this development and look at it from the point of view of 4 elements. So when we wanted to also talk to children in the local school about their understanding of spaces, and we did a lot of work with them, took photographs, we did all sorts of surveys with them, and we really, the research reports on our website, you can have a look at it. So it was our first foray into sort of talking to children, as well as mapping and as well as observing. So there's sort of 3 elements. So the 4 aspects that we thought were a bit more accurate in terms of higher density development, where you've got flats rather than just homes in the estate, is that there's the 4 aspects that you can see in the table at the bottom are access to a space. Is it easy to get to? Can you literally get to it without crossing a road from your home? Is it overlooked? Is it car free? And is it connected to another space? So is it part of a kind of chain of spaces, so that you might be able to see into another space, or you might use it as a way to walk home? And actually, that's an element that we found is really, really critical. It's probably, I would say, in fact, I would say, in my opinion, it is more important than whether that space is overlooked. I think overlooking is an element that I was pleased we got into the London plan, but I'm starting to think now that actually, it's eyes on the street, and that all those principles are true to a certain extent, but children don't necessarily perceive those as safe elements. You can be surrounded by homes and windows, and actually they don't really look after you as well as people on the ground walking through that space that you can say hello to, that you feel are there to support you. People in shops coming outside and being able to walk in. So that kind of activation is so critical. On the table at the bottom, you can see that we give each space 2, 1 or none ranking for each one of those elements, so that when you add them all up, you can get a final score of 8 down to 0. And then we colour in those spaces accordingly. What's really interesting is that the red space that gets the highest score has by far the most amount of play in it. It's got poor play equipment, but you can talk to adults about it, which we did briefly, and children particularly we talked to about how they play in that space, and they've got really fond memories of it. Interestingly, spots on the estate which weren't used very well at all, we've been able, through the estate regeneration project, to really advocate for connecting them up in a better way, so that the movement through those spaces is much better and they feel more safe. So, reducing crime, increasing children's access to these play areas that have been poorly used. So those are the 4 elements. I don't go into half as much detail when I'm talking to planners. What they like to hear is there are 4 things, look for them. If you can get them in place, we think you'll get much higher levels of children playing outside, which obviously meets a lot of their council objectives. That's the triangle I often put in front of them as well. When we're thinking strategically, we often start with pedestrians and cyclists and cars, put children at the top. They're not behaving like adult pedestrians. They're not walking to the tube. They're not walking to a destination quite often. They're playing. They're outside playing in a kind of exploring and meandering way. Think about how they move, how they might want to visit friends. Think about their lives. Think about how they don't have a fob and how they might be able to access stairwells and lifts and so on, and spaces that they want to play with. You're not going to give an 8-year-old child a fob and let them go out and play, because you'll be worried you're never going to see it again. So if you want them to be able to be outside independently, calling on their friends, really think that through. So in terms of how we might look at it from a design point of view, here's a big master plan project we've been working on. Our ideal position is to work on a project where we might have a small to medium block, so that we're architects within the team, we're thinking about it like we all do, and working on the youth and children participation, not the other age groups. This is the first phase of the master plan with Levitt Bernstein in Poplar that's completed and has been delivered. So you can see people enjoying the spaces here. The new master plan, the space we were just in a moment ago, is right at the bottom, but the new master plan continues the future phases and picks up lots of green spaces. It's actually grown a bit since we started the project, and it's got a school just outside the red line boundary, potentially within it, and then a secondary school on the other side of the A12 here, running north-south, and the A13 east-west in Tower Hamlets. This is the River Lee that's winding its way down, almost about to reach the Thames to the south. Lots of new homes. So we absolutely centred child-friendly design and planning on this project. It was front and centre, and the design team at every level, every design team member, from the highways engineer to the architects and the landscape architects particularly, the QSs, but everybody really is thinking about this from a child-friendly perspective. So there is a vision for it. The council's really behind it. We work with children and young people. We need to start thinking really strategically. We need to have diagrams like this at the beginning. How will children get around? How will they get to the shops, get to see friends? How will they access these spaces that some of these children can't use as readily as you would imagine, even though they're on their doorstep? So this is the heat map that we, so it's rather large to load, that we showed for the existing development. This is actually two neighbouring Poplar Harker schemes that we were mapping at the same time. So there's that space that we were in, the existing East India Green, which performs really well. It gets a really high ranking. It's the place that the children like the best, the one they wanted to take us to. And this is what it looks like when we've carried out the changes. So we're going from quite a cold, what we call our heat map, to somewhere quite warm. So planners like that. It's very simple. It's kind of scientific, and they can kind of understand what we're doing. It sits quite well with space syntax. So we, as was explained in the introduction, we have developed a toolkit with Grosvenor. It's 5 sessions long. It's aimed at older children at secondary school age. We often work with secondary school pupils or youth clubs. But we also adapt it to simplify it to work with primary school children. If you've ever, I'm sure you have, and I know that we've worked with the primary school at Carpenter's Road, Carpenter's Estate, when we've been working on the Pudding Mill project, and we've kind of, you often get asked to deliver it to the whole primary year group that you're working with. So it's a little bit trickier, but you can use some of these elements, particularly the traffic light system. When we're working with older children, it tends to be about 12 to 15 group of, so that you can really have some good conversations. First 3 sessions are about fact-finding and listening, and the last 2 are about their responses to the proposals. We started this within the kind of COVID restrictions, so we've got a small group here, and I'm looking up at a screen where I can see the rest of them at home online. There's one young boy here who's putting some flags into the map. They're telling us how they feel about the spaces. So we ask them to rate spaces that they know based on whether the traffic light system are red, orange or green. The green space is a space where you feel comfortable and free to do what you want to do in it, so therefore upholds your right to play if you would like to. An amber space maybe is a bit more restricted. There may be some levels of support, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And a red space is somewhere where you can't do what you want to do. Also mapping after dark, how that space might change. Then we take them outside to look at their neighbourhood in session 2. And again, they're mapping and thinking again about, in a bit more detail about these spaces, but they're ranking spaces on these worksheets, and we're looking at how they feel about them. These really vary, and depending on what the areas that you go to. Session 3, we've got them looking at a new development, so they can start to think about how the principles that they mapped previously might exist on in a place that they don't know. Really interestingly, they could see the kind of neighbourliness in this development. They could see, and one of them said, I feel like this is a place you could trust your neighbours. You've got fronts and backs and courtyards and spaces that have people have put their own plants out in. Those signs and those ways of reading doorstep social space, they were picking up on, which I thought was really interesting. Sorry. By the end of the 3rd session, they have written a manifesto for the design team to work towards. So really clear things. I want to live in a friendly place, a place for all ages, a place where I'm free and safe to do what I like. I want to be able to get around freely, and I want to live in a green, eco-friendly environment. They're themes, but we clustered all those post-it notes together under. And then finally, a whole list of things that we feel that has had a direct impact on the design due to their involvement, and I'm not going to read them all out, but this image was really well liked by them and had been developed with them in mind. There's young people in the photographs. I'm starting to actually quite late in the day look at these promotional images of projects that we work on, and recognizing that teenagers are never in the photographs, and there's a real problem with that. There's a real huge amount of discrimination against that age group. I think it's bordering on racist actually sometimes, and I think we need to be really careful how we make sure that we include them as children, because they're all under 18, in the development, and start to think about what they might want to do there. So they love this idea that it feels good after dark, because that's when they're out and about in the winter. It's got a bike cafe, it's got places for them to sit, it's got places, big slide that they can still play on, and climbing stuff. So they absolutely loved it. So final slide, what next? I've got 4 things here that I think may be happening or might need a bit of a push. A new SPG from the GLA to replace the previous one, which is great, I think. But are we doing it? Are we meeting even the 10 square metres? Should we be checking? I think that's something that there's not any money in the GLA for, but I think we've been trying to push for that. Really getting the message out. I think at London level and at borough level. And, you know, we're thinking about health impact assessments, environmental impact assessments. Should we be having child-friendly assessments? Should it be something that's at the forefront of the DAS? When we're designing, where's the child-friendly vision at the beginning? And advocacy right across all the professions. I mean, we have our design team at those sessions, so they're listening straight away to what's happening. By the time we've written the report, it's just, you know, crossing the I's and dotting the T's. They've heard it all and they're living and breathing it. In terms of participation, what are the themes that are emerging? We hear things again and again. Want spaces to be able to sit around in. I could run through them all. But really mainstreaming child and youth engagement and using our toolkit because it's free to download. And then going forward, management. These 4 themes are in the Child Friendly London document. So how will we live together? What's it going to be like once we've delivered it and walked away? And then the final one that I would really like to see, we all know about the closure of youth centres and we all know about the destruction of sort of play work. Why aren't we building them in new developments, new large developments? Why are we placing community centres and expecting communities to be able to support their young people in the ways in which we know needs that kind of level of expertise and work? And I'm asking developers on all developments that I work on now that are large enough, we should be providing a youth centre. It's not surprising the kind of reaction that I start to get, but it's very difficult, I think, to break that negative image about young people. But actually, now's the time to do it. And I think we could even do it through the Section 106 system, but it needs a little bit of a push. So the triangle, just to remind you again, put children at the top and you'll get better places. That's the end of my chat. Sorry if it was a little bit too long.
No, that was perfect. That was great. Thanks, Dinah. Actually, really inspiring stuff. And it's good to see. I don't know, I'm coming from an Irish perspective, and it seems like in London and the UK they're slightly further ahead than where we are over here. I guess that kind of feeds in nicely to what I was hoping to discuss quite quickly. I'll just share a screen. So I was just going to quickly run through about why I'm interested in the topic in the first place, and why I do feel that children and younger people should be involved in the planning process, and how our streets and developments are framed into the future. And this all came from a research project that I was doing in UCD for my thesis, which is called Playful Resilience. And firstly is kind of why do I actually care about this? Because a lot of people think that, oh, we don't need to involve the young people because us adults know best. Firstly, I'm a big kid myself, and secondly, in UCD, in the module we were doing on kind of like the history of Dublin, we were encouraged to read a few books which is about old school Dublin in the 20th century, and talking about tenement life and Dublin street life, and kind of stories of early times in Dublin where it wasn't necessarily the nicest place to live, but the stories that the community and residents were telling, and that were mapped really beautifully by this chap called Kevin Kearns, kind of really just evoked some kind of memories for me. And I was like, Jesus, we should be doing something about this. And hopefully when in 20, 30 years time, we would talk about our space the same way that these people did. So I've kind of littered this presentation with some photos and quotes from these books, which have kind of inspired me to develop my interest in how our streets are viewed and how children should be involved in the planning process itself. But these are all photos from between 1910 and 1950 in Dublin. And the main thing that you can see in these photos is that children are on the street. They're playing in the street, and in Dublin especially, where it was dominated in kind of the early 1900s by tenement housing, and it was extremely dense, and the quality of housing wasn't very good, so the children didn't want to play in their homes or in their gardens. All of them were outside on the street. And while these spaces, or while it was viewed as kind of a difficult time to live, the stories that people were telling was often very positive, and they looked back very fondly on their childhood. And that kind of led me to begin to look at is just where did all the children go, and what happened when people began to move out of tenement housing in Dublin and move out to the suburbs and areas across the country. And it just began to seem that the children were pushed into more organised play, where they didn't have that freedom or that ability to meander or move between space and kind of make their own rules, essentially. And that essentially led me to begin to map and look at what provision is there in Dublin for play, and what infrastructure exists, how much space there is, beyond the more kind of statutory elements, such as your kind of regular playgrounds, the parks, which Dublin's known very well for, and community resources, parks, playgrounds, sporting institutions, elements like that. And ultimately, what I found with mapping kind of inner city Dublin is that there's not a lot of space for children at all. And as in the previous photographs, these spaces, you don't see them. They're not involved, kind of integrated into the transition between space, and often even with kind of your normal play equipment, they're quite depressing places to play, which I think this photo is quite great. It's kind of just a sole kind of rocking horse just sitting around kind of bunch of green space that often you're always told no ball games here, or you're not allowed to actually play on the grass. It's quite uninspiring. So that's kind of led me, and I think we're kind of lucky. The only lucky thing to come from the pandemic is that we seem to have now reached a point where everyone is asking the question of, we need to take back our streets and claim them back, which kind of led me to work that Aldo van Eyck did in kind of post-war Amsterdam, where he built over 700 playgrounds, often on infield sites or unused spaces in the city, and integrated play and put children first when thinking about how our cities and how our developments were reorganized. And these photos are something that I'm just starting to think about, is that maybe now we can look at spaces like this and see that if we're in Dublin, especially, we're taking back car parking spaces and giving them to outdoor dining and pedestrianising some streets. And if we could look at play as a kind of a centre of how we kind of develop these spaces. And then one thing that Dinah touched upon was that idea of independent mobility for children, which I think is the one thing that we should consider highly when involving children and young people in the planning process is that often when we are travelling between spaces, that is where children themselves play the most, rather than playing in a playground or going to the football pitch or going to the park. And for different ages of children, as you get older, you have different levels of mobility. So often in our practice, we have some extremely large developments where there's a long travel distance between. It's important to consider and ask young people how they would travel between spaces. It's often that the youngest kids don't normally walk in a straight line. They kind of meander between spaces, kind of using their curiosity to look at different objects. And I think that's really important to consider as we kind of begin to involve young people more in the planning process. And this was kind of one of the quotes from the book, where it was that playgrounds were there, but children essentially selected their own play spaces, and that was centred in the streets and the laneways that surrounded their houses. And then as they get older, that circle or that space for play essentially got wider and wider. And my personal belief is that we should involve children and young people a lot more in the planning process, and we should fight and advocate for their involvement, because they have great ideas and they have a different way of looking at spaces that us adults don't necessarily have, which is kind of a more, I don't know, I suppose a bit more fun and looking at a bit more looser kind of sense. And building with them, involving them in the process often helps, especially with teenagers, like Dinah mentioned, helps kind of alleviate some concerns. And look at spaces like this one in the photo here, where a project that I've been doing with the council, they've been discussing that antisocial behaviour is a big issue, and that's something that they want to address. And this is at the start of the process, but now we're involving and working with teenagers in schools to develop a response that is centred around them and how they use these spaces. And I think using the tools that Dinah's discussed and Tom will also kind of touch on a bit more will really help kind of display huge benefits to clients into the future. And that's that. Stop sharing. Then over to you, Tom.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Ozan. And again, touching on a lot of Dinah's points, and I think my presentation will also do the same. So if you'll bear with me, I will share screen. I think mine will be probably a little bit shorter. Can you all see that okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. So I'm going to talk about briefly about my experience of how Crawley Newtown built a community through play, and the kind of legacy that has been left in the town as a result of that. There are lots of middle-aged fans of building communities through play, because Crawley, by and large, was a huge success in doing that. So just a bit of context, most of you probably know Crawley came about as a result of the Newtown Act in 1946, one of the designated areas for building a new town, and it was one of several satellite towns, partly to rehouse Londoners from slums and bombed out homes. It's a self-contained town, as they're all intended to be. The original concept that it provided absolutely everything that the residents needed in very, very easy reach within a beautiful setting. So the original Newtown plan included 9 walkable neighbourhoods around the town centre, and they were all designed along Garden City principles, with housing layouts broadly arranged around mature landscapes. And it didn't just pay lip service to mature landscapes, they really did plan routes along existing routes. For example, there are a number of manor houses around the periphery of Crawley, which were incorporated into the new neighbourhoods. Some of them had big grand driveways that were over a mile long, with gatehouses that are still there today. Some of them, regrettably, the council allowed to be demolished, but nonetheless, the grand thoroughfares, some of the new streets and spaces were planned along. So each of these neighbourhoods, no residents more than 500 metres from the local centre, and each local centre includes a pub, a church and a community facility. But what I really want to talk about is the play centres. So 7 of the original 9 had prefabricated play centres, which were single-storey buildings clad in concrete panels, which were about 7 metres by 16 metres. And in there, they offered activities like pool, snooker, table tennis. They had a range of arcade machines. Entertainments used to come in at holiday times, and you could also do arts and crafts. and they catered for age ranges anywhere really from 5 up to 16. So this slide shows the play offer as it was really from the beginning and up to around 1990, which was when cuts started to bite and the play offer started to diminish. So I'll start first of all with adventure playgrounds up here. Just reading this description, the emphasis in adventure playgrounds is on outdoor play with complete freedom, firelighting, unbelievably, camp building, digging and playing with unconventional play equipment. So that gives you an idea on how children were given the freedom to play as they saw fit under guidance of a play leader. And actually, most of the play facilities in these places were actually built by the children themselves. And I can remember going to one of the 3 adventure playgrounds in Crawley, Cherry Lane, and they had a zip wire where they had connected it to the tallest oak tree. The oak tree had ladder rungs nailed to it, which you climbed up to about 20 feet high. The zip wire was 50 meters long, and it collided with an oak tree 50 meters away, which was wrapped in a mattress. So very kind of haphazard. You wouldn't get away with that today, but they were hugely successful. Then the other categories down here actually all relate to the play centres, because they're all services which were provided by the play centres and organised by the play leaders themselves. So there were 7 play centres, and as you can see here, they were open every day after school, 3:30 to 7 p.m. I used to go there virtually every day, and then on a Saturday it was open all day. And the great thing about these play centres were that you met children outside your own age group and outside your own local school as well. So they were fantastic for establishing a social network, and then of course these children all grow together and become adults, so that there's a real legacy of forming friendships right across the town. Talking about where I lived, so I lived in Gossip's Green, which was on the west side of Crawley, and my house is located by the white dot here. Coming back to the benefits of informal play, the play centre for me was only 1 minute walk away, but my home was adjacent to one of these great manor drives. So there used to be a big manor in Buckswood just here, and this is the driveway that led to it, and then there used to be a gatehouse here, and the street that my house was just off of, Dale Walk, was planned along this. There were lots of copses of trees, lots of opportunities for incidental play, and the local shopping precinct's only 44 minutes down the hill. That's what Dale Walk looks like today, and there were more trees along it at one stage until the Great Storm of 1987 kind of blew about 30% of them over. But you can see still that there was plenty of spaces for play, and actually these places were as used, I would say, as the local kind of park and play area, because there was just so much for kids to do and make in these spaces. And the Buckswood is at the end of the street here, so if you didn't build a camp here because you felt you were too exposed, you would just go up to the wood at the end of the street, and there were tons of opportunities for incidental play. Looking at the current situation, so the number of neighbourhoods has expanded from the original 9 up to 14, and 2 of them have been really established since kind of the late 80s, but they're both privately built. So there's Maidenbower, which is number 4 here, and Forge Wood, which is over a much larger area at 14. These have both been delivered by volume house builders, predominantly private housing, but no access to even shops upon their completion initially. Forge Wood still has no shop, and everyone there has to drive to the neighbourhood at number 3 to get there to their local convenience store. Not so local, but they don't have anything in the way of play provision really for children, other than in centralised parks, which are actually too far away for most of the residents to allow their children to go alone. And of course, the play offer as it currently stands, you can see wiped out in red is everything that's disappeared. They tried to shut the adventure playgrounds in the last year, but social media backlash meant that they were forced to retain them, but they're now unsupervised. So the play equipment is very much scaled down from what it used to be, and they've become really nothing more than slightly larger kind of play areas really, and certainly wouldn't be described as an adventure playground in the way that we see it. Anyway, I think in summary, Crawley has a huge number of middle-aged people now that experience what it was like to grow up during the 60s, 70s and 80s with the provision of this play. And I think universally they mourn the loss of the kind of community spirit and play opportunities, both formal and informal, that we had growing up, which is sadly denied to many young people today. And you know, as Dinah said, why aren't we building youth centres? Because not only does it serve the purpose of building friendships and community, but there's probably a link there with crime as well, because if kids have got nothing to do, you know, they're more likely to get involved in kind of low-level crime in their area, because they're not occupied. So you know, I think we all agree that provision of child's play spaces, both formal and informal, is woefully under considered at the moment, and I think we've got to think very seriously on how we resell that idea back into the mainstream, because I can imagine it's quite a challenge to sell that idea to many developers, and particularly volume house builders. Thank you very much.